Life in UK, My Best Friend and My Wife. Part 2. Eric walked with slow, heavy steps through the village gate, his heart sinking with every glance from the villagers. The once bustling village now seemed like a foreign place, a place where he no longer belonged. Whispers followed him, eyes filled with pity or disdain. His clothes, tattered and worn from months of wandering, barely kept him warm, but it was Nana Prempe's smile that softened the ache in his chest. "You'll find your strength again, son," the old man said, his voice warm and full of quiet wisdom. Eric didn't believe it, but he nodded anyway. He had nowhere else to go. The farmhouse was a shadow of its former self, now reduced to dilapidated walls and a roof that leaked with every rain. Eric stared at the holes in the ceiling, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen. His pride was gone, and with it, his hope. He dropped his sack onto the floor and sank to his knees, the weight of the years crashing down on him. "This is my life now," he whispered bitterly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. The walls seemed to close in, but there was no escape. Not from the house, and certainly not from himself. The sun beat down mercilessly on Eric as he gripped the hoe, his fingers raw and blistered. The earth was hard, unforgiving. Every movement felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Sweat dripped from his forehead, mingling with the tears he refused to shed. "This is impossible," he muttered through gritted teeth, collapsing to the ground in frustration. His arms ached, his spirit was broken, and he hated himself for it. Why couldn't he just walk away? Why couldn't he let it all go? Appeared, a beacon of kindness in a world that had turned cold. She handed him a basket of food, her eyes full of empathy. "I'm not here to pity you," she said calmly. "I'm here to help." Her words were like a balm to his weary soul, though his anger flared nonetheless. "I don't need your pity," he snapped, shoving the basket away. But Bodama stood, her ground, her smile unwavering. "It's not pity," she said softly. "It's kindness." Eric looked at her, the words she spoke unfamiliar but strangely comforting. Still, he resisted. He didn't deserve kindness. Botema returned to the fields the next day, offering no words, only silent help. She worked beside him, planting seeds with a gentle hand. Eric remained silent, angry at the world and at himself. Yet there was something about Botema that disarmed him. Her quiet determination stirred something deep within him, a flicker of hope he'd long buried. She never asked for his permission, simply worked alongside him. Over time, his resistance softened, though he never acknowledged her efforts. Her presence, though, became a small comfort, one that made the pain a little less unbearable. One day, Botema accidentally knocked over a basket of freshly harvested vegetables. Eric's frustration reached its boiling point. "Can't you do anything right?" he shouted, his voice rough with anger. Botema calmly bent down, picking up the vegetables without a word. "You're angry at someone else, not me," she said softly. The words pierced through Eric, though he couldn't admit it. His anger was like a wall, and he had no idea how to tear it down. As he watched Botema work tirelessly in the fields, Eric's thoughts drifted back to Peace, the woman who had once been his everything. He remembered her vibrant determination when they first moved to London, the dreams they built together. But somewhere along the way, those dreams crumbled, just as their marriage did. Why did she change? Eric muttered, the ache in his chest deepening. But the answer was too complicated, tangled in betrayal and unspoken hurts. For the first time, Eric felt the sting of regret for his behavior toward Botema. He stood before her, awkward and unsure. "I've been unfair to you," he admitted, his voice laced with shame. Botema smiled, her eyes kind. "We all carry burdens, but they don't have to weigh us down forever," she said. Her forgiveness was not something he expected, and it humbled him deeply. Maybe, just maybe, he could start over. Bodama's resilience became something Eric admired from a distance. One day she showed him a better way to plow the land, a technique her father had taught her. Eric couldn't help but be impressed, though he masked it with a scowl. "Not bad for someone who always spills baskets," he muttered under his breath. But secretly he was grateful for her presence, for the strength she embodied. It was a strength he hadn't known he needed. Boatema told him a funny story about a mischievous goat in the village, and for the first time in months Eric laughed. The sound felt foreign, almost painful, but it was real. It was the first spark of joy he'd felt since everything fell apart. Boatema smiled at him, her eyes twinkling with a warmth that melted the ice around his heart. "You haven't smiled in a long time," she teased gently. Eric wiped a tear from his eye, not sure if it was from laughter or the sudden release of years of pent-up grief. Either way, he hadn't felt so alive in a long time. One evening, after Eric had been drinking to drown, his pain, Boatema found him sitting alone, the bottle clutched in his hand. "You're letting your pain win," she said, her voice firm but filled with compassion. "You're stronger than this." Eric's eyes narrowed, and he shot back, bitterly. "What do you know about my pain?" Boatema's gaze softened, her presence unwavering. "I know enough to see that you're still carrying it," she replied quietly. Eric stared at her, the challenge in her words breaking through his hardened exterior. A fierce storm swept over the village one night, the winds howling like wolves and the rain falling in torrents. Eric was struggling to secure his crops when Boatema arrived, drenched but determined. Without a word, she joined him, helping to salvage what they could, both of them fighting the storm together. The sky flashed with lightning and the field turned into a swamp of mud and water. Eric's heart was full of frustration and fatigue, but Boatema's quiet resilience anchored him. "We can't let it go," she said, her voice steady above the roaring wind. The sense of solidarity in their work, the shared struggle, brought Eric a sense of connection that he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Boatema nodded, never letting her focus waver. She was his strength in the storm, and in that moment, he realized he didn't have to face everything alone. Eric overheard Boatema talking to Nana Prempa one evening, her voice filled with unwavering belief. "Eric doesn't realize how much potential he has. I believe in him." Eric's heart skipped a beat. Boatema, with all her kindness and strength, had placed her faith in him. She believed in him when he couldn't even believe in himself. The weight of her words sat heavy in his chest, and for the first time, Eric felt the stirrings of something long forgotten. Hope. Could he really rise from the ashes of his past? Could he become the man she saw in him? The thought terrified him, but it also filled him with a strange determination. Under the quiet shade of a tree, Eric finally opened his heart to Boatema. His words came out in a broken rush as he told her about his marriage to peace, the betrayal, and the betrayal that led to his deportation. He spoke of his shame, his anger, and how he had lost himself in it all. Boatema listened intently, her eyes full of compassion, never judging him. "Your scars don't define you," she said gently. "They show that you survived." Eric's eyes welled with tears. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like that. For so long he had felt defined by his pain, but Boatema's words pierced through the darkness, offering him a glimmer of light. Eric found himself looking forward to his time with Boatema. They laughed together, shared stories, and for the first time in years, Eric felt something resembling peace. The weight on his shoulders began to lift as they worked side by side, dreaming of a future beyond the farm. There were moments when Eric allowed himself to imagine a life full of love, hard work, and joy. Boatema's unwavering support had slowly chipped away at his walls, and Eric realized that he was no longer just surviving. He was beginning to live again. The day of the first harvest felt like a miracle. Eric stood in the field, his hands trembling as he picked the ripe vegetables that Boatema had helped him grow. His pride swelled in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. The work had been hard, painful, and sometimes almost unbearable, but it had paid off. Bodhima stood beside him, her face full of pride. "You did this," she said softly. Eric looked at the baskets of vegetables, the fruits of their labor, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This was his redemption, not just in the work, but in the love and faith that had helped him rebuild himself. Back in London, Peace's life was spiraling out of control. Bright, once the man she had leaned on, had become controlling and angry. Their relationship turned toxic, and Peace, desperate to escape, began seeing another man. One night, their argument escalated, the violence tearing through their home. The argument ended tragically with Bright's fist landing on Peace, and she fell, lifeless. The news reached Eric through a visiting villager. As he listened, the shock was almost too much to bear. The woman who had betrayed him had met a violent end. There was no joy in it, no satisfaction, only an overwhelming sense of sadness and closure. Eric sat at a wooden table, the letter from the villager trembling in his hands. The words were clear, but they didn't make sense. Peace was dead. She was gone. The bitterness he had carried for so long began to melt away, replaced with a heavy, aching emptiness. He had spent so many years angry, consumed by betrayal, and now there was nothing. No closure, no revenge, just the weight of a love lost and a life wasted. His gaze lifted to Ama Bodhima, who sat beside him, offering silent comfort. The healing, it seemed, was still a long road, but it had begun. Ama Bodhima, ever the source of support, organized a small celebration for Eric's birthday. The villagers gathered around, offering their congratulations for the hard work he had put into the farm. Eric felt overwhelmed, not just by the celebration, but by the realization of how far he had come. His thoughts turned to Ama Bodhima, to the love she had shown him. When she handed him a small cake, her eyes were filled with kindness, but also something deeper. In that moment, Eric understood he loved her. He loved her for the way she had believed in him when he had no belief left, for the way she had shown him that he could still change. Under the starry sky, Eric took Ama Bodhima's hands in his heart beating wildly. "I love you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You've shown me what I was missing. A heart that sees me for who I am." Ama Bodhima's eyes filled with tears, and she smiled softly. "You were worth the wait." In that moment, the pain of the past faded into the distance. Eric had found love again, and it was pure. It was real. It was his redemption. With Ama Bodhima by his side, Eric transformed the farm into a thriving business. Together, they poured their hearts into the land, rebuilding their lives from the ground up. The hard work was relentless, but they were no longer alone. Each success, each step forward, was a testament to their resilience, their love, and their shared dream for the future. They were no longer just two broken people. They were a family, and together they could accomplish anything. Eric stood before the modest home he had built for Ama Bodhima and their future. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And it was just the beginning. He turned to her, a smile on his lips and pride in his eyes. "This is just the beginning," he said. Ama Bodhima nodded, her heart full. "We've already come so far." Eric felt the weight of the journey behind him, the struggles, the heartache, the pain, and realized that every step had led him here, to this moment of peace. Ama Bodhima gave birth to their first child, a healthy baby boy. Eric, overwhelmed with emotion, held his son in his arms, his tears falling freely as he whispered, "You'll grow up knowing how to love and be loved." In that moment, Eric understood the true depth of the redemption he had sought. His son was the culmination of his struggles, his healing, and his love for Ama Bodhima. The pain of his past still lingered, but now it was a distant echo compared to the joy that radiated from his family. The tiny hands of his son gripped his finger, and Eric knew, deep in his soul, that his life had come full circle. He was no longer the man haunted by bitterness and regret. He was a father, a husband, and a man who had found peace at last. Years passed, and Eric's life transformed completely. He was no longer the broken man who had arrived in the village with nothing. Now he owned multiple farms and homes, his businesses thriving. His relationship with Ama Botama had grown stronger with each passing day, and their love had brought him the redemption he had so desperately sought. One evening, as they sat together in front of their home, Eric turned to his son who was playing nearby and said, "Your mother saved me in every way that matters." The weight of those words held all the pain, all the healing, and all the love Eric had come to know. He wasn't just successful in business. He was successful in life because he had learned to love, to forgive, and to let go. He had been redeemed by the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. Years after building a new life, Eric stood in front of the old farmhouse where his journey had begun. The roof was sagging, the windows cracked, but the memories still lingered. He knelt down and placed a single flower on the ground, a symbol of gratitude and closure. "Thank you, Nana Prempa, for giving me hope," he whispered to the wind. That small, run-down farmhouse had been where he had found his second chance, where he had learned the meaning of resilience. Without it, he would have never rediscovered who he was, and more importantly, who he could become. Eric woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The nightmare had come again. The images of Peace's betrayal, the fear of losing everything he had worked for, the feeling of being abandoned and rejected. The memories of his deportation and the anger he had held onto for so long flooded his mind. He sat on the edge of the bed trying to catch his breath, but the weight of it all seemed unbearable. His past still haunted him, like a shadow that refused to leave. Ama Boatama, always attuned to his pain, came in quietly. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and in her touch, Eric felt the warmth and love that had slowly replaced his rage. "The nightmares will fade, Kweku. You have a future now," she said softly, her voice a balm for his soul. Eric nodded, feeling the truth of her words. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but he was no longer the man who had been consumed by bitterness. He was someone who had learned to heal, and with Ama Boatama by his side, he knew he could face whatever demons from the past remained. One afternoon, as they worked in the fields, Ama Boatama spoke of her late mother's wisdom. "Life only breaks you to help you grow stronger. You're not broken, Eric. You're growing." Eric paused in his work, the weight of her words settling in his heart. It had been a long and painful journey, but each struggle had shaped him into someone stronger, someone better. Her words had a deep resonance, a truth that Eric had known but had never fully embraced. The pain he had gone through was not a punishment, but a lesson in resilience. He smiled at Ama Boatama, feeling a quiet gratitude for the strength she had shared with him, for showing him how to rise again, even when he thought he couldn't. Eric had never fully forgiven himself for his mistakes in his first marriage. The bitterness, the anger, the way he had let those emotions consume him, it all weighed heavily on his soul. One day, he visited the small village church, the place where he had once found solace. Sitting in an empty pew, Kweku reflected on his past. He had hurt Peace. He had allowed his bitterness to destroy what they had. The guilt was still there, but for the first time he understood the importance of forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself. He prayed quietly, asking for the strength to forgive, to let go of the past, and to move forward with a heart full of love. As the sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, Eric felt a sense of peace wash over him, something he hadn't felt in years. He was ready to face the future without the burden of guilt. Ama Boatama's faith in him never wavered, and one day she surprised Eric by organizing a community event to celebrate the success of his farm. The village came together to honor His hard work and local farmers and business people gathered to show their support. Eric was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, but he had never imagined that his efforts would be recognized in such a way. Ama Botema stood beside him, her eyes filled with pride. In that moment, Eric realized that the love and faith Ama had shown him had been the driving force behind everything. She had seen his potential when he could not see it himself. And now he was no longer the man who had been defeated by his past. He was someone who had been redeemed by the love of a woman who had never given up on him. Eric had come a long way from the man who had arrived in the village with nothing but regret. Now, as he knelt in the field beside his young son, teaching him how to plant seeds, he knew that this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. A legacy of growth, love, and resilience. His son, Enoch Prempe, looked up at him, eager to learn, and Eric smiled. This was the future. This was what mattered now. As his son worked beside him, Kweku could see the man he would become, a man who would carry forward the lessons of love, hard work, and forgiveness. This is what I want to leave behind, Eric whispered to himself. A legacy of growth and love. The end. Click on the like button. Share it to your friends and loved ones. Thank you.